Welcome to week number 2 of the Brain, the Body, and Spiritual Disciplines. Last week, we took walks in our neighborhood to see it in a different way. We looked at our lives by drawing maps of our activities and relationships. We studied the connections between focusing on a geometry problem, prayer, and loving our neighbor in the Simone Weil article. We looked at the importance of reading our context as a place to start when doing practical theology or any kind of reflection on practices, and then moving into what do I think, what do I feel, and then moving into dialogue, both within ourselves, with others, and with God, and then having that moment of rest. This week we're going to be talking about cosmology and worldview, but before we get there, I wanted to say a couple more words about attention. All intentional attentiveness, all commitment to pay attention, no matter how small, it exercises our attention muscle for all uses, no matter how small it is, even on that geometry problem. It will help us to be focused in other contexts and other situations. So really, when we're thinking about spiritual disciplines, paying attention could be considered one of the foundational practices, one of the foundational first puzzle piece of all that we are attempting to do in this course. Kay Anders Ericsson, a researcher in the new discipline of expertise studies, talks about something called deliberate practice with regards to becoming an expert. And you actually may have heard some of his research popularized by Malcolm Gladwell and the 10,000 hour rule. But there's a little bit more to it than what we are commonly hearing in the media. Simply practicing something over and over for 10,000 hours, rote practice, will not lead to a person mastering a new skill or becoming an expert. It requires attentiveness and intentionality over time. Anders Ericsson looks at musicians, athletes, professionals, military strategists, and those in the medical profession. To use an analogy from music, practicing a song over and over through the mistakes does not help build mastery. Rather, targeted, deliberate practice on the very areas that are causing the challenge leads to mastery. So practicing 4 notes over and over until they're played well, and then going back and playing the whole through that part, now that you know how to play those 4 notes well, is better than simply stopping at the point the mistakes are made and then restarting and getting to that same spot. Actually, what's happening there is a person is being practiced to make mistakes at that point. In a similar way, when we find ourselves not being attentive or feeling like we are not practicing the disciplines we have intended to practice, asking questions about what is happening, breaking it down to a few notes, so to speak, is a better response than what I often hear from students and from professionals in the ministry, where they have a sense of guilt. I can't do this, I'm failing, I should be doing better. Let go of the guilt. Guilt about doing spiritual disciplines or not doing them well enough is a poor motivator. Guilt is simply a poor motivator. Rather, use this experience as a challenge for information. I find that when I am lost my own rhythms in spiritual discipline, it is often because of 2 seemingly small details. I'm not sleeping well over a period of time, or I'm not taking enough boundaried space, just a few moments each day, to practice a relaxed silence. We're all always beginners on our journey as disciples of Christ, and being gentle with ourselves as we're practicing spiritual disciplines, it's not something that's going to go away. We're always going to be faced with new challenges, new things that are going to be coming up in our lives, and so each of these provide an opportunity to think through, how do I practice even in the midst of this situation? So now it's a new week, so I'm inviting you to bring what you learned from last week, to set an intention to carve out space for reflection this week, and then let God work on the rest. So if there were things you weren't able to get to, and you're interested in going back and picking those up, please feel free to do that. But don't feel that you have somehow failed by not doing those things. Do what you are able to do and then move on. This week, we're exploring cosmology. Cosmology sounds like a scientific term, and it is. It's a study of the universe. But it also can be used to discuss worldview. Cosmos in Greek means world. This makes for an interesting deepening reading of the classic verse, John 3:16. God so loved the cosmos that he gave his only begotten Son. We often think of the world as the earth, but cosmos is larger. It's all of creation, and when I say all of creation, I mean the entire universe. As theologians, and you are a theologian by virtue of asking questions about God and reflecting on the answers, we need to look up. We need to look up in the context we find ourselves in. Remember last week's tetrahedron. Start with the context. We are not simply in our neighborhood, town, country, or on the planet Earth, but also part of a vast cosmos of billions of stars and billions of planets, and maybe even some other life forms out there. I hope so. And we're also part of a cosmos that was created 13.7 billion years ago. When we start to think about that, what happens, at least for me, is I start to realize my God is too small. I need to have a much larger understanding of who God is to be able to encompass such a vast creation. God so loves the cosmos that he gave his Son. This puts things into perspective. And we may not think about this enormous reality every day. I don't. But when we practice spiritual disciplines, we do need to think about how that reality might inform those practices at some level, even if it's only subconsciously. Do the practices that we are practicing fit within this larger context that we understand as God's creation, whom we are a part of? How we view the world affects how we practice. The early church understood this in the phrase lex orandi, lex credendi. As you pray, so you believe. It's Latin, so that also means you can reverse it. As you believe, so you pray. So both are true. We discussed that our theories are practice-laden, and our practices are informed by theory. The Christian tradition understands the power of beliefs in shaping practices, but even more, knows that the practices themselves have shaped our worldview. So here's a concrete example. If I pray in a particular way, I make a statement about who God is, even by virtue of praying. I'm saying God listens, or that God responds, that there's a purpose for praying, and that it will cause a change of some sort by its practice. Just by the fact that I am praying, I make claims about who the God is to whom I pray. All practices are practiced within a wider cosmos, a worldview within which they function. So to take the practice out of that worldview may cause the practice to lose its meaning. So you can think about that in the context of prayer. If I'm praying in a context where there is no belief in God, that God hears or that God responds, then praying for God to hear or God to respond seems somehow dissonant with the context that it finds itself in. So the worldview and the practice, there needs to be a sense of consonance between the two. Now we often practice many things, and sometimes they don't fit with our worldview. I often find that people will pray and they have a deeper understanding of the importance of prayer, but their actual worldview may not fit with that. And so then it's just a matter of them kind of bringing to the table their practice of prayer and saying, oh, well, actually I do believe that God hears and that God listens, that God responds, and that there's some sort of change going on, because I believe prayer is very important. The opposite could also be true. A person could say, I believe God hears and responds and that some change happens, but prayer is simply not happening because at a deeper level, the worldview is that God does not hear, does not respond, and that prayer really does not affect some sort of change. You see how the two play together. So the question to you this week is, what is your worldview? Who is God to you? Who isn't God to you? Often that's an important question to ask as well. We all have images of who God is, and we also have aversions to who we believe God is not. And those can be just as insightful, the positive as well as the negative attributes. And then take it the next step and think, how are my practices informed by my understanding of who God is? And how has my worldview and my understanding of who God is been informed by my practices? And think practices broadly. Practices could be praying, it could be walking in nature, it could be going to church and worshiping with a community, it could be Bible study and reading scripture, the revelation of God, it could be talking to people. So think of practices in a wide variety of ways and how those practices might have affected your worldview. Now, I bring all of this, you might be thinking, so what does this have to do with the brain and the body? Well, one of the challenges we have is that our view of the human body, which is part of this cosmos, this world that we're talking about, is informed by both our view of God and how we understand God's relationship functions with the world. So how our body functions within this world, and then what is God's relationship with this body that is within the context of creation. So in the early church, this was a huge issue, and I actually don't think it's gone away. There was a group of Christians that were very influenced by Greek philosophy, certain strands of it, and they were called the Gnostics, and they understood that all matter, this is the stuff of creation, was evil, and that the spirit was good. And they felt that this was offensive to think that God would have come into this stuff that was evil. In fact, they thought that it was impossible that God would come into something that was evil. So it was very difficult for them to understand the incarnation. Now, the church argued against this and said, look, this is the revelation that we have in Scripture, that Jesus was incarnate in human matter, in human flesh, and that this is part of the good news, that God so loved the cosmos that he came in Jesus Christ. This was huge. It was very provocative, and as I said, it was very offensive to some groups, that God would stoop so low as to become incarnate. Now, we're going to talk more about this worldview and some of its effects next week, but the Gnostic worldview did affect the Christian tradition for many centuries, and it still does. And so imagining our bodies as somehow involved in our spiritual practice and not just dismissed as a source of sin might be a new idea, or at least an idea that is not heard frequently in sermons or in Bible studies. So it's something we need to wrestle with. What is our understanding of the relationship between the body and the spirit? One way to reflect on this is to consider the difference between an idol and an icon. An idol is something that demands worship. So imagine that when we look at an idol, whatever it is, it wants the gaze to stop at itself. And the reason I bring this up is that often the body is seen as some sort of idol, that its needs, its wants, its desires are somehow wrong or evil because we have this tendency to idolize those needs, desires, or wants. Now, with an idol, anything can become an idol, even positive things, even things that are good and life-giving. People, experiences which are normally life-giving can become idols. So yes, so in some situations, what we experience in this world through our bodies can become idols. However, it's not the whole story. So, a little more about idols. When something or someone or an experience becomes all-encompassing, it has power over us in a way that may no longer bring joy, but actually bring suffering. And the idol is not encouraging our best, but its own worship. And so again, we'll talk more about this next week, but we're going to be looking at the Ten Commandments and how God uses those commandments to point to possible idols in our lives and to point us towards life-giving practices. Now, an icon is Greek for image, and we actually in Scripture, in Colossians chapter 1, we see that Jesus Christ is the icon of the living God. So when we see Jesus, we are seeing God. By looking through Jesus, we are seeing God. And that's exactly what an icon does. An icon invites us to this wide, open reality, into God's love, into God's beauty, into the vastness of God's creation. It doesn't stop our gaze. It doesn't demand worship in the sense that in a way that is going to prevent us from worshiping God. The only person that can be large enough and loving enough and wise enough to fill that space, that hole in our lives that we often put the idols in. So this week, thinking about that, idol and icon, thinking about worldview, thinking about the relationship between our body and the rest of the cosmos and the spirit, I invite you to look deeper. I invite you to look higher. I invite you to look beyond. And then to share some of your reflections with the group as you engage with certain of the practices and the videos that I'm going to be posting. Reading your experiences that you share and the insights that have encouraged you as you reflect encourages me, and I think it encourages everyone in this course. So if you have the chance to share some of your insights, I would greatly appreciate it.